Hello, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Today I'm sharing the top 3 ways I reserve leftovers, along with a few ways I save a butchered loaf of bread or other baked goods. First, we're jumping to a double batch of biscuits I made that sadly were way too dry. The recipe called for 3 cups of buttermilk, and I only had 2 cups of plain milk. Spoiler alert, that wasn't enough. So I froze this batch, and when I baked a few the first time, they were just dry hockey pucks, completely uneatable. But I had like 12 biscuits left in the freezer, and I just couldn't reconcile throwing them away. So in an effort to save these biscuits and give them the moisture they were lacking, I used them in breakfast stratas and French toast casserole. For the strata, I browned a half pound of sausage with a few diced potatoes. You could even add peppers and onions at this point. After baking the biscuits, I tore 3 apart and tossed them in the mixture. By the way, this cast iron pan is about an 8-inch diameter. Then I whisked together 6 eggs and 1.5 cups of milk, poured the egg mixture over the meat mixture, and topped with cheddar cheese. Then I baked at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 to 35 minutes, or until it was cooked all the way through. And here is a close-up of the French toast casserole that I made out of the rest of the biscuits. I also baked it at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 to 35 minutes. Next, we have a quick tutorial for making breadcrumbs from a botched loaf of bread, where I somehow forgot to put in both oil and salt. And there we have a tunnel straight through the middle of the bread. After dicing the bread into cubes, spread the chunks along a baking dish and bake for 20 to 25 minutes at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, or until crispy. Now you could stop here for croutons or little crispies to add to soup, but today we are going one step further to blend these crisps into breadcrumbs to be used in meatloafs and meatballs. If you're making an entire loaf of bread into crumbs, I'd blend them in 2 batches to get a more even crumble. Moving on to our repurposing of dinner leftovers. This soup has been on repeat for my family the past few weeks. We make it with pork, chicken, and beef, but the rest of the ingredients stay the same. The meat from this soup usually comes from a slow cooker barbacoa roast, but sometimes I'll just use roast chicken. Today I'm using half an onion, 1 bell or green pepper, and 1 pickled jalapeno, courtesy of my father. After those veggies have softened, I add 1 teaspoon of cumin and 1 teaspoon of oregano, 1 teaspoon of salt, and a half teaspoon of pepper. Then I add half a cup of uncooked quinoa and let everything toast for about 1 minute. You could use uncooked rice here too. Now, if you made slow cooker burrito bowls earlier in the week and have some rice and beans left over, you can definitely add it to the soup too. Following the quinoa, I add a small can of crushed tomatoes. Today I'm using some tomatoes I cooked down that were frozen from the garden. You could use diced tomatoes or even whole tomatoes and dice them. I've even tossed in the last fresh tomatoes ripening on our kitchen island. If using that method, just cover the pot and cook on medium-low until the tomatoes burst easily and lose their shape. Even with all these different tomato options I've tried, this soup turns out absolutely delicious every time. So after mixing in the tomatoes, we're adding in our roast meat and a jar of home-canned white beans, but any bean will do. Finally, add a bit of whatever broth you have on hand to loosen up the soup. We like it pretty thick over here. Cover the soup and let it warm through until serving. I prefer to serve this with lime, Greek yogurt, cheese, and corn chips. For our next leftover dinner revamp, we're making a chicken pot pie. I roasted an entire chicken earlier this week, and I'm using that for this cozy pot pie. I'm also taking extra time while preparing this pot pie to refill my freezer bags of chopped celery and chopped onion to save a step in my future cooking. If you're interested in learning more about Save a Step cooking, I'll link that video in the corner. When it comes to celery, I like the flavor it adds to cooked foods like soups and stuffing, but I like for it to remain unobtrusive within the dish. I just prefer to not munch on a half-inch chunk of celery in my soup. So here's the method my father taught me for finely chopping celery. And who knew? I was doing it backwards until last year. So once you've cleaned your celery, first slice the stalk down its long length, depending on how diced you like your celery. Then take your knife perpendicular to all these thinner celery sticks and chop to your desired size. To this pot pie, we're also adding carrots, fresh green beans, and onions. I'm dicing the green beans in about half-inch pieces. When I chopped the onions, I moved onto my stove to use the overhead fan. I heard this tip from Elizabeth Parsons and was looking forward to not sobbing when cutting onions for the first time. And it worked until it didn't. I just had so many onions overpowering the fan, but if I had only been doing one onion, I think I would have been just fine. Into a large pan or even pot, soften half a cup of onions, half a cup of celery, 1 cup of carrots, and 1 cup of green beans. I'll link this recipe below for you to check out closely. This one has been a tried and true recipe for me for 3 years now. To thicken the filling, add 1/3 cup of flour to the sautéing vegetables and stir, toasting the flour. Once the flour is evenly distributed through the veggies, add your chicken broth, stirring gently and constantly until there are no more flour clumps in the texture. Then add whole milk and let the mixture cook over medium-high heat to thicken. While the filling is thickening, I'm rolling out the crust. The crust I'm using is Grits and Gravy's freshly milled pie crust recipe, modified to use only butter, and it's incredible. Absolutely a stunner recipe. This is my first time making freshly milled pie crust, and I'm still figuring out how thin to roll the crust, how much crust to leave around the edges and such. But I've used it for pumpkin and apple pie, this pot pie, and little jam hand pies. I really enjoy Grits and Gravy's recipes because they deliver a big batch at the end. This pie crust recipe makes 4 pie crusts, which freeze excellently. And her biscuit recipe makes 18 to 20 biscuits for me. Once your filling has thickened, add your chopped chicken and seasonings. I prefer using poultry seasoning and pepper. Now, this chicken pot pie recipe calls for letting the filling come to room temperature to thicken up a bit more, but I don't think I've ever done that. I always just scoop it out hot into my crust. And as you can kind of see here, the heat from the mixture made the top of my crust nearly unworkable. But even though the crust was a little wonky, it still was a pleasure to eat. For our final dinner leftover upcycle, I'm making a Farmhouse on Boone inspired skillet dinner, except instead of a sourdough topping, I use a cornbread topping. Since I still haven't gotten around to cultivating a sourdough starter from scratch, but a church friend did promise me some discard from hers, so hopefully we'll be working with sourdough again here soon. Anyway, I'm softening onions and potatoes in a cast iron skillet. While that mixture cooks, I'm mixing up my egg-free cornbread recipe. We do have a food allergy in the house. One of our kids is allergic to eggs, so I've been tweaking many of my staple recipes to be egg-free, which is actually going really well. I expected eggs not to substitute out so easily, but Greek yogurt is working excellently as an egg substitute for us in recipes. If you're interested in how I incubate our homemade yogurt in a cooler, I've linked the video in the corner. So I'm taking leftover meatloaf and kind of browning it in the pan and making sure it's evenly distributed throughout the mixture. Then I'm taking my cornbread batter and pouring it over the meatloaf mixture and baking it according to your cornbread directions. Mine is at 400 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 minutes. You can make this skillet dinner a pot roast flavor, a faux chicken pot pie. There are loads of ways to get creative with this skillet dinner. I'd love to hear which of these dinners you'd like to try first. What are your go-to ways of preparing leftovers differently from how you first served them? Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.